Our first speaker of the evening is Dr. Liisa Galea. Dr. Liisa Galea is a professor in the Department of Psychology and a member of the Center for Brain Health and Neuroscience program at the University of British Columbia. She's also a distinguished university scholar, has held a Michael Smith Senior Scholar Award, and Natural Science and Engineering Research Council Discovery Accelerator Supplement. She's won the Cattell Sabbatical Award and the Vancouver YWCA Women of Distinction Award. She's had over 120 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals and over 6,000 citations, with over 500 citations per year for the past 4 years. For those of you who aren't in a science background, that's a lot. She's an editor of the scientific journals Neuroscience and eNeuro, and serves on the editorial boards of Endocrinology and Hormones and Behavior. She developed the first animal models of postpartum depression, was among the first researchers worldwide to study hormonal control of adult neurogenesis and the impact of motherhood on the brain in later life. With her current research, she seeks to establish how sex hormones influence brain health and disease in both females and males. So if you guys could join me in giving her a warm round of applause.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really excited to talk to you for the next 20 minutes, that's what I've got, about maternal adversity and how it might differentially affect daughters and sons. And before I talk about that, I am going to be talking about sex differences, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page, because I'm talking about the biological and physiological differences between males and females, and not gender, which is a psychosocial construct, which is what a given society, in this picture, what Canada deems appropriate for housekeeping behaviors for men. So there are a lot of sex differences that you can see across the animal kingdom, most notably in body size. I'm just talking about body size right now. In most of those species, you can see that the males tend to be larger than the females, but in some species, it's the females that are larger than males. In avian species, it's the males that are thought to be more beautiful than the female of the species, but other species, I'd say the opposite. In terms of genetic similarities, there's a 99.9% similarity between two men. But you can see that despite the genetic similarity, that 0.1% can make a big difference in terms of behavior. Now, thinking about a man and a woman, the genetic difference between a man and a woman is 15 times greater than 2 women or 2 men. And again, this is something that isn't always appreciated in the literature for study. It's beginning to be recognized by the FDA, by our federal funding agencies, and popular media that we need to consider sex in terms of our health. So those of you that are researchers will know that CIHR and NIH in the US is now demanding that we use both sexes in our studies. But 60 Minutes had a really great episode. You can find it on YouTube if you're interested. In 2014, where they talked about the FDA for the very first time suggested there needed to be a different dose, not a different drug, but a different dose in men versus women. The first time ever, 2014. And let's just think about this for a second. I'm going to use my son, who's 6'3", and his old nanny. It's not his nanny anymore, who's 4'8" on a good day. To illustrate that men should require a different dose than women, right? They're heavier than women typically. And on our bottles of medication that we pick up in the drugstore, it doesn't say by dose. It just says if you're an adult, take 1 or 2 pills. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, we can talk about brain disease. So there are a lot of sex differences in prevalence of brain disease, and boys are more likely or more prone to neurodevelopmental disorders. And women are more prone to disorders that appear during adolescence and in adulthood. And in terms of mental health, you can see a number of those disorders favor women, but some of them favor men. And for a number of these mental disorders, stress plays a big role. Now, where the stress occurs also plays a big role. And I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but you can have stress early in life that seems to predispose the male sex to disorders like autism and ADHD. During puberty, you see a greater incidence of OCD in females and women, teens, I guess I should say, and also depression. That's when you start to see a big sex difference in the prevalence of depression. While there's no sex difference in schizophrenia, males are more likely to present with schizophrenia earlier on in life, whereas women are more likely to present with schizophrenia later on in life when they're adults, and again, after some kind of stressful situation. And even postmenopausally, we can see some large sex differences in the effects of stroke and stroke prevalence, but also in Alzheimer's disease, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I'll be talking about maternal adversity early in life today. So you can think of maternal adversity in both during pregnancy and in the early postpartum stages. And we've actually developed some models to look at stress during pregnancy or stress during the postpartum phase. Now, it turns out that there are a number of different factors that will play a role in terms of how offspring develop. Both the health of the mother, that makes some sense, but also her environment. So Stacey Bilbo has some really nice data showing that pollution, diesel pollution plus stress can increase the prevalence of autism spectrum-like symptoms in male offspring. What's less studied is the placenta. The placenta also plays, which I realize is a big role in the health of the offspring. So in terms of even fetal sex, maternal diet, all seem to play a role. And there's a very nice new study showing that placental health correlated with or interacted with a gene propensity for schizophrenia to increase the risk for schizophrenia in boys later on in life. I've been mostly focusing on the early postpartum, but perinatal depression can be both. You can have depression during pregnancy or the postpartum, and about 40% of women will have experienced depression for the first time ever during the postpartum period. Women that experience depression during pregnancy, it's a little bit of a different story. So most of them will have had a history of depression and have more severe depression, and that prenatal depression will often bleed into the postnatal period. So it doesn't necessarily resolve by a year where postnatal depression can resolve. And you can imagine that the effects on the offspring can be come from different origins. You've got an in utero exposure versus an ex utero exposure. In utero, you might be affecting the placental health, and you certainly will be affecting epigenetics, the gene expression. But also ex utero effects can also affect gene expression. So you can imagine that maternal behaviors might be affected, and that might influence offspring development, as well as whether or not the woman decides to breastfeed. And as I said, often prenatal exposures will bleed into postnatal care, and so it's important, or is one reason why we use animal models to try and dissociate the two effects. Now, I'm a neuroscientist, so I have an obsession with the hippocampus. It's probably an unhealthy obsession, but I'm trying to get help for it. Why is important for memory and emotion? It shrinks with depression, which is, I think, super cool. It also shrinks with pregnancy, which is also super cool, and it doesn't bounce back. So people have done some studies where they've looked 2 years after pregnancy, and you still don't see the hippocampus coming right back to the same level as you'd see before preconception. It's also affected by both sex and stress hormones, and it's very plastic in adulthood. I'm just going to show you some examples of that plasticity. So hormones like estrogens can influence the number of spines, those little protrusions like doorknobs that you see there. That's the way the cells communicate with each other. We also know that chronic stress causes a reduction in the complexity of these brain cells in another specific region of the hippocampus, and we see a big sex difference in the influence of that dendritic complexity. I'm really happy to answer questions about that because it has completely different functional consequences for the animal. But my favorite region is the dentate gyrus because it displays the ability of it retains the ability to produce new neurons or new brain cells throughout life. And that's true in all mammalian species. Also happy to answer questions about that. I'm going to talk about my model now. But before I do, I would just want to tell you something, a little story. This is a statue from a Neolithic civilization, and it was very obvious in this civilization that they revered the pregnant and fertile women. And then I think we went through a very dark period in our history where women were sequestered during pregnancy and childbirth, and nobody talked about it. And then I'm going to blame Demi Moore, who posed on the figure on the cover of Vanity Fair, all pregnant. And I know you don't find this very shocking, but at the time, this is shocking. In 1991, people didn't do that. You definitely didn't see naked pregnant female bodies. Now I'd say you pretty much do almost every day, because every celebrity, every royalty are displayed on those gossip magazines that you see in the checkout stand. And so you could be forgiven for thinking maternal adversity, what's that? Pregnancy is a glorious, wonderful, beautiful time. And I don't know what she's talking about, so I thought I'd share with you the worst picture of me ever taken in my life. And it's to prove a point. It's to say that it's actually very trying on a woman's body. Some of my research is looking at how that might affect the brain. But it shouldn't be so surprising that there might be repercussions for pregnancy. So in the short term, it's postpartum depression, it's actually the time of greatest risk to develop depression in a woman's lifetime. Postpartum psychosis, it's rare, but it does occur. And obsessive compulsive disorder is 3 times more likely following birth. But just so those of you that are in the reproductive age don't go away and never have children, it's important to know that there's a decreased risk for a variety of cancers as well. So we've created some animal models to target either during gestation, depression during the postpartum period, so we can try and tease apart what effects there are on the offspring. And we did this with a very simple model where we just gave a stress hormone, corticosteroid, to the pregnant or postpartum mother. And I'm sure many of you are very skeptical. How can we possibly look at depression or anxiety in an animal model? Well, you can't really. You can ask them if they're depressed, but you can look at their behaviors and you can look at certain symptoms of depression, which again I'm happy to talk about. We can look at maternal care. We can look at how much time they spend taking care of their offspring. We can look at passive coping in something called the forced swim test, and we can look at anxiety-like behaviors. We can look at hormone levels. We know that stress hormone levels are very different in people with depression, and we can challenge them with something called the dexamethasone suppression test. And of course, we can look at the hippocampus, which we know is implicated in depression. We'll look at neurogenesis, the birth of those new brain cells, and we can also look at inflammation, markers of inflammation, which we also know is tied to depression. So what did we find in the mums? I'm going to tell you the mums all on a table, and I'm going to show you the offspring in graphs. And so during the postpartum, we found that for all of the things we looked at, we saw evidence of a depressive-like endophenotype. So they reduced maternal care, they showed passive coping in the forced swim test, and they showed reductions in dendritic complexity and reductions in neurogenesis, or that brain cell growth. That's in the moms. When we gave high court prenatally, we saw reductions in maternal care and reductions in neurogenesis and the hippocampus, but we didn't see any effect on depression. So it was a very different phenotype that we saw in the mom. So what effects do we see on the offspring? Again, even though perinatal depression is not categorized either as prenatal or postnatal depression, we know there's different outcomes on the mom. And there are some studies that indicate that there's different outcomes for the offspring as well. So in terms of prenatal depression, you see more behavioral and psychomotor development issues. With postnatal court, you see more social and emotional development issues. So boys are more likely to present with anxiety, and girls are more likely to present with depression. And so we wanted to tease apart these things using an animal model. Do we see the same kinds of things? And certainly we saw that with prenatal exposure to high court to the mom, and this is now in the offspring, we saw only the animals that were whose moms had received high court during their pregnancy, they were more likely to show depressive-like behavior. Whereas the moms that received high court during the postpartum only, so it's only going through the breast milk and affecting her behavior, we saw increased anxiety. And in terms of their own stress levels, we actually saw reductions in animals whose moms were given high court during pregnancy, but increases in offspring whose moms were given high court during the postpartum. So completely different sort of constellation of symptoms that we saw. Well, what about sex differences? That's sort of the title of the talk. In terms of anxiety, it was males only, and this is typically what you see in human literature as well. In terms of the stress hormones being either lower when their moms were exposed to high court during pregnancy versus the postpartum, it's higher postpartum. It's really the females that were showing this phenotype. That data was driven mostly by the females. We've also looked at neurogenesis, and we've looked at it across the lifespan in both males and females. And it flips around, and it's going to be confusing, and that's the beauty of science, because there's never an easy answer. And I'm going to also tell you that context likely matters. But for postpartum court, we see reduced neurogenesis in the juvenile males, but only in the adult females. Something wacky is happening during the teenage years, which I think we can all agree something wacky always does happen in the teenage years. We've been looking more at depression, at treatments of depression. So we've been looking at antidepressants, pharmacological antidepressants like SSRIs. SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And there is some evidence, and it's very controversial, that SSRI exposure during development may increase the risk for autism spectrum disorder. Now, it probably depends on the trimester exposure, it depends on the type of SSRI, but it also depends on whether or not the mom has had a history of maternal depression and whether or not that exists postpartum. And so again, to tease this apart, it's good to use animal models so we can expose those offspring to SSRIs during selected periods and see what we find. So we've actually looked at a pharmacological and a non-pharmacological antidepressant. Exercise apparently is a mild antidepressant, so I urge you all to do as much exercise as you can. It's good for our brain health. And really, I often want to divorce my husband before I go for a walk, but after my walk, I love him again. So it's very helpful for marital issues as well. So we actually see that fluoxetine, which is Prozac, so an SSRI pharmacologic, it mitigates against all those deficits in maternal care. But exercise is the only thing that actually gets rid of the depressive, like the passive coping we see, and gets rid of that reduction in neurogenesis, not fluoxetine. So why might SSRIs not be working in the postpartum period? We see this reduced, there's a few things, I'm just giving you a few little tidbits. We see reductions in neurogenesis, we see reductions in hippocampal plasticity. We know that neurogenesis is involved in the behavioral efficacy of antidepressants, that might play a role. But the postpartum is also associated with a reduction in serotonin signaling. And those SSRIs, they don't increase serotonin in the brain, they just increase what's in there, what's available, let's exist for longer. So if there's less amounts there to begin with, that might be why it's not working as well. And Wan-Soo Chu, who's a new graduate student in my lab, she's also seen that we see increases in neuroinflammation. So these cytokines are increased with fluoxetine in the postpartum. That's the exact opposite of what you see in a non-postpartum situation. That might be another reason why it's not working. But what about the offspring in the last final moments I have? So moms increase neuroinflammation, and offspring, it decreased neuroinflammation. So completely opposite effects. We've looked at anxiety. We saw an increase in anxiety, much like we see with postpartum court, but only in the males. We don't see it in the females. And when we look at neurogenesis, we just see a very small effect just in the very early stages in females only. We don't see it otherwise. This is probably one of my most favorite findings. So exercise, maternal exercise, this is in the adult offspring. They've never exercised in their life. Okay, it's just the moms that exercise. Maternal exercise increased neurogenesis in the offspring. I think that's pretty fascinating. But when we also gave them fluoxetine, that totally decreased that effect. So we no longer saw an effect on neurogenesis of new brain cells. Lastly, we've done a little bit of work with Tim Oberlander looking at humans. And in humans, sex matters as well. So this is looking at a neuroplastic protein called relin, looking at girls and boys that were exposed to SSRIs in utero or not. And it was the females that were exposed to SSRIs that we saw this reduction in this neuroplastic protein, not in the males. So this is my attempt at a roundup. It's really bad, but it gives me an excuse to put all these pictures of my children up. And they are almost all they are adults now. I love this picture because I think that's quintessential teenage girl. And you can see that we see different changes depending on when we look in the timeline. And the other thing I want to warn you about is that little asterisk. It says context dependent. And so maybe somebody wants to ask me about that. But sometimes we see these effects when we stress the system a little bit more and not if we're just looking at it at basal. And that's, I think, really important because in the human literature, of course, we can't control for context. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you and looking forward to the questions.